Welcome back from spring break. We're now in the second half of the semester. Uh, Another 8 weeks, including finals week, and we'll be done. Now, I don't know, 8 weeks is 8 weeks, but it sure seems to me that the second 8 weeks of the semester goes way faster than the first 8 weeks of the semester. So bear that in mind and remember that you have a project due at the end of the semester. Also notice the points that the project counts for. The points are turned in two sections. One is due March 20th, that is this Wednesday, and that's worth 15 points. To put that in perspective, that's 3 of your assignments. And the final project, which is due in May 8th, is worth 20 points. That is 4 of your assignments. If you don't turn these in, that's 35 points off of your score. And that would give you 65 out of 100 points, which means that if you got everything else perfect, you would get a D in the class. I'm not saying this to scare you, but just to point out how important these 2 assignments are. So keep in perspective that and make sure you get it done as soon as possible. The one question I get from students all the time is, I don't know what to do my project about. A lot of times I get that the day before the project design is due. My suggestion to you is pick something you enjoy. Pick a topic that you enjoy, whether it be a hobby, athletic team, someone in the entertainment field, some technical application. Video games gets a lot of attention by people in this class and so on, but pick something that you enjoy. And because it's my thought that you will do your best work if it's something that you're doing that you enjoy. You can pick something personal. A person did there's once on their motorcycle collection or on their motorcycle, and they're going to make their page look good because they love their motorcycle. So pick something that's going to motivate you to work on it is my suggestion. Review the lecture where I talk about the design, because some people are a little confused about what needs to be in the design, and I went over that in detail. All right. The one thing I will say is these are not examples of goals. It's not an example of goals to say the project will have a good navigation or a clean navigation. That's not a goal. That's also not a requirement. That's an assumption. All right. The assumption is that your application is going to be user-friendly and has a good navigation and all those positive qualities that we talked about is just plain old good web design. So you don't need to state that. You'd only state that if the opposite was possible. Like, do you want your page to not have a good navigation? Of course not. That's an assumption. Goals are what people want to achieve by visiting the site. Requirements are the pieces of content you're going to put on the site that relate specific to the goals. So again, clean navigation or good navigation is not a requirement either. I mean, it's assumed that you'll have that. A requirement would be that, a restaurant is going to publish nutritional information for their meals because some of their users might be interested in that. And that might be one of their goals, is to find out if the meals at this restaurant meets their nutritional needs. All right. So the goals are what the person wants out of the site, and the requirements are what you're going to give them to achieve those goals. Go over the lecture again. If you have any questions, send it to me, email it to me, and I can take a look at it and put you in the right direction. And then again, the final project is due on May 8th. So today we're going to talk about something that we've been sort of doing bits and pieces of throughout the whole semester. All right. Actually, I take that back. We talked about that last time. We didn't go over the mobile example last time. That's right. We're going to go over the mobile example today. But here is a useful site. We're going to do a couple of things before we look at the mobile example. We didn't go over the mobile example the week 8, did we? Does anyone remember that? I don't think, boy, my memory isn't so good. Let's see. Nope, we did more CSS layouts, including grid and flexbox. Good, so we'll go over the mobile example today. We're gonna go over two things first, though. First thing we're gonna go over is a website called Can I Use? All right. This is a website that probably was more important in the past than it is now, but it's important because features are always added to CSS and HTML, right? Web browsers, though, aren't always perfectly up to date with the new rules for CSS or new tags in HTML. They're a little bit behind. All right, it makes sense. If the W3C organization comes up with a new rule, W3C org is the organization that publishes the web standards. They come up with a new feature for CSS or something like that, and they announced it today. All right, they come up with, say that that there will be a new revision of CSS that handles this a certain way. The people that create the web browsers, the Googles of the world, the Microsofts of the world, the Apples of the world, need some time to incorporate that into their browsers. All right, that's what this Can I Use shows you. So I can go in here and type in something like Flexbox. That's one of the most popular ones. And if you look at that, everything, the green means that the browser can handle it. So Chrome has been able to handle it since version 21. And we're way past that version now. We're on version, where do I see that? I don't know. Trust me, we're way past version 21 in Google Chrome. Internet Explorer, however, up to Internet Explorer 9 doesn't handle it. And 10 and 11 only partially handle it. Now, you should not be using that, but there's a possibility that someone that has not updated their computer in a while might have used, might be still using that, even though it's very, very old. This was released over 10 years ago. So it's probably very unlikely. So that is a pretty safe thing to use because all of the recent browsers are in the green. Here's another example, WebP image format. We've talked about images before, and we've talked about JPEGs and GIFs and PNGs, I think. WebP is another image format. And again, you can see that most of the recent browsers do handle WebP as an image form, as an image format. I said that this is probably more useful than, was more useful in the past than it is now. The reason for that is W3C produces versions of these new things, and there hasn't been a new version of CSS and HTML in a long time. But I would assume if you would hear announced, for example, that CSS4 is coming out, you might want to check a site like this to see what percentage of people use them and don't use them. Okay, here's a new one. CSS anchor positioning. And no one supports that. So you might want to be avoiding using that. All right. The other thing is a question that I've gotten dozens of times, and that is, how do I put files in different folders? And this is most important when you talk about your portfolio, because you might have index.html for 3 different labs, right? Lab 1 might have an index.html, lab 2 might have an index.html, and lab 3 might have an index.html. Well, you can't put all those in the same folder, right? Because you can only have one file name. You can only have one file with the name index.html. So the way around that is by putting things in their own directory. So put lab 1 in its own directory, put lab 2 in its own directory, put lab 3 in its own directory. All right. How then do you refer to those files? I had a lecture about that, and I talked about it. I believe it was week 6 when I went over the portfolio. So if you have questions about that, review the week 6 lecture. If you still have questions, here's an example of using absolute and relative paths. So for example, this works with links, by the way, as well. This works with links as well as images. So if you say image source equals picture.jpg, that means the picture JPEG is in the same folder as the current page. The picture, if you say images slash picture.jpg, picture is in the images folder in the current folder. So images would be a subfolder of the current folder, and then you have picture.jpg. You wouldn't want to use this right now. There's times when you'd want to use this, but since we're not dealing with web servers in this class, it's probably best to avoid this right now. Web servers have associated with them a root directory. And if you say /images, that takes you to the web server's root directory. And the ... says the picture.jpg is located in the folder 1 level up from the current folder. And this applies again for web pages, images, style sheets, and JavaScript. And it shows you examples of each of those. Best practice to use the relative file paths. What are relative file paths? 1, 2, and 4. So use those techniques to refer to files within your application. All right. On to mobile browsing. We talked last time about responsive web design. And the idea of responsive web design is that your web page should change based on the size of the browser window that it's in. All right, that's it in a nutshell. What that means is we're going to use percentages instead of absolute pixels. So we're not going to say that something is 1,000 pixels wide. We're going to say it takes up 80% of the screen or something like that. We're going to do that for images as well. We're not going to say an image is 400 pixels. We're going to say an image takes up maybe 50% of whatever it's in, and so on. The last ingredient to responsive design is something called a media query. And I've alluded to probably a few times in this class the fact that you can have multiple style sheets associated with a page. All right. And media query takes advantage of that fact. And it does it in a way so that you can have one style sheet that applies to everyone, and then have a second style sheet that applies only to computer screens as opposed to mobile devices. So let's look at this mobile example. Two mobile examples. They do the same thing, but they do it a slightly different way. So you can decide which way you prefer. All right. It's a page about Star Wars. As we notice that as we make it bigger or smaller, these areas get bigger or smaller. And in fact, the image gets bigger and smaller. Now, when the page gets to be a certain size, or if the page is viewed in a mobile browser, the page transforms. So it's getting smaller, the columns are getting narrower. All of a sudden, boom, we have this. And if it was on a smaller phone, it would look like this. Another way that you can see how a page would look like on a mobile device is to go up to More Tools, pick Developer Tools, and then choose this option here to say Device Toolbar. And you could show how the phone would look like on an iPhone SE or an iPhone 14 Pro Max or Samsung Galaxy. So this is truly a responsive design because it looks different on a mobile device than it does on a desktop computer or a laptop computer. So how do we do that? Well, we do that through what's called a media query. And if we look at our HTML, we have two style sheets. I have a style sheet called main. The syntax for that looks like the syntax for every other style sheet we've used. Rel equals style sheet, type equals text CSS, href equals main.css. So this main style sheet, you see right here, applies for everyone. No matter who is browsing this page, no matter what their browser is, the main style sheet applies. We then have a second style sheet. But notice there's like a little extra attribute here, media. And media specifies under what circumstances does this style sheet appear, right? This style sheet will be used, I should say, what circumstances will this style sheet be used? This style sheet will be used if you are on a computer screen. That's what media equals screen is. I know mobile devices have screens too, but that's just what it means. It means a computer screen when you say screen. And the page is at least 800 pixels wide. That's why when we view this page, and the width is set wide, we see this. What we're seeing right now is a combination of these two style sheets. The main and this one. The main everyone gets. This one you only get if you're on a computer screen and the minimum width is at least 800 pixels. So we go along and we get below 800 pixels and this style sheet does not apply and we're only left with this one style sheet. This approach is called the mobile first approach. In other words, you design what the mobile is going to look like first. And again, I think you've had an assignment about this. I don't know if it's due yet or not, but if not due, it's due in the very near future. Mobile web pages typically are simpler than pages for the desktop. All right, simply because people browse on their phones differently. It's a different way to interact with a web page on a mobile phone than it is on a desktop. And very often, single columns are the way you want to go for a website. All right, so very often you want single column web pages on a mobile, and that's what we've done here. On the desktop version, yeah, okay, we could have 3 columns. That's fine because there's enough space to see them and our eyes can move back and forth. But here, we want only a single column. Also made it simpler a couple of ways. I've gotten rid of the background image. I guess I don't absolutely have to do that, but it is a simpler way of looking at it. And that was my way of saying that, hey, generally speaking, you want the web page to be simpler when it's being viewed on a mobile device. Sometimes you don't want all the content to appear on a mobile device. For example, notice this section and this section that says, here's another section. This one says desktop only, and so does this one. Those only appear on a desktop computer because sometimes it's the case that you will not show quite as much information on a mobile homepage, on a mobile page than you will on a desktop page. So notice as this page gets smaller and we go to single column, section, 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 those 2 sections labeled desktop only, however, do not appear in the mobile version. The whole idea of this is we define a style for everyone first. We design the basic bare bones style that we want the mobile page to have. And then we overrule those things in this second CSS file. But that CSS file doesn't apply in all the cases. It only applies, in this case, on media equals screen, and the width of the page is at least 800 pixels wide. Now, you can use a media query too to give a different format for printing. A lot of websites do that. They have a separate style sheet if you're printing the page. And typically the style sheet is simpler. The web page is simpler. Because if you go to print a page, you don't necessarily want to see all the background images and all the ads and all that, right? You just want the basic text of the page. So if you've ever gone to print a web page and you notice that the print version of the web page looks different than the page that displays on your screen, that's because they have a style sheet with media equals print. All right. Can we do that real quick? Let's try that. So I got rid of that to say media screen, and it says media print now. So only the main style sheet applies. If I go up here and say print, I stand corrected. Let me Google that. Oh, get rid of that too. Huh. I'm not sure why that isn't working. Oh, well, we'll move on from that. The bigger point is that this applies in all cases. This applies only if it is a computer screen. So let's look at the two style sheets and see the difference. Let's start out by looking at the main. The main is what applies all the time. So I've defined the body as having a background of yellow. Which it does. The font family, Helvetica, Arial, and sans serif. The header is 90% of the page, a border 1 pixel, black solid, margin 0 pixel auto, so it centers it. Padding equals 5 pixels, so there's 5 pixels between the border and the text. The header section, H1, the font size is 2M. Font family is Times New Roman and serif. Navigation, 90%. These basically have all the same style rule, all the sections and all that. Now, for the image within the section, I say the width is 100%. That means 100% of the section. So that's why you notice that it doesn't take up the whole screen, but it takes 100% of that section. And it says maximum width auto. That means it won't get any bigger than the image actually is. You know, the image has a certain number of pixels. The page won't size it as being bigger than that number of pixels. Here is the one thing that gets the desktop only stuff hidden. I have dot desktop only. Now, what does dot desktop only means? It means the things that have the class of desktop only. The things that have the class of desktop only. And we can look and see that these two sections have a class of desktop only. When do we use a class? We use a class when there is one or more things that we want to style the same way, but we don't want to style everything of that particular HTML tag that way. So we don't want every section to be styled this way. We only want those sections that have a class of desktop only. I use a class instead of an ID because there might be more than one thing that I want to only display on the desktop. Use an ID when you're pointing to just one particular thing on the page. The rest of it is fairly self-explanatory. All the sections, pretty much, all the areas definitely say something like width 90%, border, margin, auto, padding 5 pixels. So they all end up being a single column because all of their attributes are the same. All right, now we get to the other CSS file. And this CSS file is going to overrule the first CSS file. What do I mean by overrule? It means it's going to add these things on top of these things, sort of. Why is it doing that? It's doing that because that style sheet is after the style sheet. So these things get applied, and then if the screen is at least 800 pixels wide and it's a computer screen, these things get layered on top of it. If, for example, I switch these, mobile version looks the same, but the desktop version doesn't have the background. Why not? Because now the body tag in the main overrules the body tag in the desktop. Whereas if I have them in the order that I had them originally, the stuff in the desktop CSS overrules the stuff that's in the main CSS. So you generally want them in this order. You put the mobile style sheet first, and then you overrule that with certain things in the desktop version. So let's look at the desktop versions CSS. Body. We now define the body as having a URL of BG PNG, background color of black, and a text color of black. So that overrules the background color of yellow. And it adds on that background image. Why? Again, because it's after. This stuff overlays the stuff on this. So in both of them, I have the background attribute, but the background attribute in desktop.css applies because desktop CSS is after main.css. Now, however, notice that I don't have anything about the font family in the second one. That means the font family is going to be the same as defined in the mobile one. So the font family is not overruled in the second style sheet. Only the background image is overruled. I then have a style for the wrapper, saying the wrapper is a grid. We talked about the grid layouts last time. I talked about the heading as spanning 3 columns. So our heading goes over, our header goes over 3 columns. Our section takes up only 1 column. How do I know that? Well, because I don't have a grid column start and end. So if I don't have those, the default is that it takes up 1 column and 1 row. The nav, however, it starts in row 2 and extends down to row 5, which means it covers 2, 3, and 4. So that's why the navigation stretches down to here. And I have some other overruling too. The nav, I give an opacity so you can see the image peeking through. That doesn't exist in the mobile version. Finally, desktop only, I say display equals block. That overrules display of none that exists in the mobile browser. So again, just to review the important concepts here, this page has two style sheets. This one has no media query, so it always applies to every page, no matter what it's being viewed on. This one has a media query of screen and minimum width 800 pixels. That means that if it's on a computer screen and the screen is at least 800 pixels wide, this style sheet applies. Because it is after this style sheet, anything that we put in this style sheet is going to overrule anything that we put in that style sheet. And we saw that with the background. Background in the mobile version simply says the background's yellow. The background in the desktop version says the background is actually this URL. We don't say anything in the desktop version about the fonts of anything. Therefore, the font rules in the main CSS apply in all cases. Now, for your assignment, that is not due this Wednesday because I'm a nice guy, remember, because your project design is due this Wednesday. You're going to create a web page about good design principles for mobile web development and a second page about accessibility. And you can Google that. We'll talk about that next time. Using progressive enhancement is another way of saying mobile first. So I'm going to change that because that's the term I use today. You must use a media query. So you have to design it using a media query like this so it looks different if it's being displayed on a mobile device. Okay, here is the other CSS file that we have, or the other example rather that we have. And if you look at it, it's going to behave the same way. It just uses a slightly different coding style. And again, I had a student way back when I first started teaching say, why do you show us how to do things a couple different ways? That's just confusing. It's like, all right, well, if it's confusing for you, then just take a little nap when I explain the second way to do it, all right? And relax for a minute. The reason I show it to you is because you might encounter a situation where you're changing someone else's web page. Or you might see an example online where they use a different approach than the first approach that I teach. So I try to teach different approaches so you can take a look and use whichever approach makes sense to you. Now, in this case, it behaves the same. What's the difference then? The difference is then, we look at this HTML index.html, there's only one style sheet that's called main CSS. I actually have the desktop style sheet in there, but you don't need it. So I can delete it. Now, how does it work when there's only one style sheet? The media queries are built inside the style sheet. So if I look here, I have, this was my old copy of main.css. And then I have my media query right in the style sheet instead of on the link tag that says that, hey, these are the style rules apply if I'm on a desktop screen or a computer screen and the width is at least 800 pixels. So really doesn't matter. The same thing here. These overrule what's in the first part of the style sheet simply because it appears after it physically in the CSS file. So you can do it either way, whichever way makes more sense to you. All right, any questions about this? Next week, we'll be talking about accessibility. And that's a really important issue that I don't think is always given the attention that it deserves, right? Accessibility is taking web pages and making them accessible to people regardless of what their abilities or disabilities are. All right. And you might say, well, you know, if someone's blind or someone's deaf, how can you compensate for that? Well, there's no way you can necessarily give the full experience to someone that has an extreme disability like that. But you can compensate for their lack of being able to see or hear certain things by including certain content on the page. Likewise, there's a whole bunch of people that aren't necessarily fully blind or fully deaf, but maybe have trouble hearing or maybe have trouble seeing. All right. And there's things that you can do for them that can help them out. So that's what we'll talk about next time. Are there any questions? Okay, we'll either see you in lab or we will see you next week.